We are live. My name is Christian Davenport, and with Erica Chenoweth, we bring you this year's Conflict Consortium virtual workshop, which we do in memory of Will H. Moore. It's been a while, so we just want to remind folks, there's no presentation. The discussion starts off with a discussant or several discussants. The paper giver responds. Then we go to the floor and we go to the conversation. Now for etiquette, one finger is a new point, tends to be a little bit longer. Two finger is for a relatively brief point that's directly connected to something that somebody's trying to say. Someone will serve as chair, taking notes. That'll be me to reference the cue. I normally go like that when I see that your 1 or 2 is up. If I miss it, then just shoot me a message in the chat that you hit a 1 or you hit a 2. Good? Good? Okay. Today we have Tijen. Help me. Tijen. Why do I keep rolling that? My fault. Demirel-Pegg. The role of government tactical adaptation in the demobilization of protest campaigns, the Gezi Park case. Courtenay Conrad will get us started as the first discussant. If you could, as we begin, could you mention your name and affiliation as we begin, and then we'll know who everybody is. Good. I'm actually, hold on, I'm not seeing Erica move, which is just, Erica, you still there? I presume she will jump out and come back in. So Courtney, why don't you get us started? Remember, introduce yourself first after you unmute.
Great. Hi, I'm Courtenay Conrad from the University of California, Merced. Hi, Tijen. I really was excited to read this paper, Tijen. I really like the question you're asking. I'll sort of give a 2-sentence overview here. So Tijen is broadly interested in the relationship between repression and dissent. But what's really interesting here is that she's specifically focused on how governments adapt repressive tactics to changes in dissident tactics. So one of the things I really like about this paper that I haven't seen before, that I'd like to see you focus on, is that this is about the tactical adaptation of tactics by both the government and the opposition. And so that's a really big contribution, especially given this endogenous relationship that we know exists between repression and dissent. So it's a lot to take on in a paper, and I think, Tijen, you do a really great job, both theoretically and empirically, tackling this question. So the big sort of take-home point here is that where previous work argues that governments cannot quickly adapt to this tactical innovation by dissidents, you argue and show some evidence that governments can adapt, specifically if dissidents have this weak organizational structure from the outset of the dissident campaign. So Christian and Erica asked me to start off. So I'll start off with 3 broad suggestions. So Tijen, all of these comments are intended to be suggestions and hopefully will help you, push the paper forward and make the paper better. So in the spirit of that, let me get started. So 2 of my comments are theoretical, or primarily theoretical, I should say. And then one's related to the quantitative research design and the empirical test. But all 3 of them are going to be motivated by your main hypothesis. So I want to start there. So here's your main hypothesis. And I'm taking this from the statement that you have on page 8. So when protest campaigns with weak organizational structures innovate new tactics, governments are more likely to demobilize the dissidents if they use repressive strategies that target campaign leadership and their support networks. So as I'm reading this, like, the dependent variable here shows up in your empirics, and that's the demobilization of dissidents. But when I read the independent variables that show up in that hypothesis, it seems to me that there are 3 of them conceptually. So change in dissident tactic, the strength of the dissident organization, and then the extent to which repressive strategies target dissident leadership. So that sort of is a good opening for my first question, which again is theoretical, but I think has some empirical implications. So what's the relationship between those 3 independent variables? So for example, what's the relationship here between dissident organizational structure and then the ability of dissidents to change tactics? So are they independent? So the hypothesis kind of intimates that they are, but there are places in your theory where they're clearly not independent. So you say that organizational structures are important because without the ability to replace leadership and support, protesters just don't devise new tactics. So that makes me think that only dissident groups that are strongly organized can innovate new tactics, which makes me question whether or not they're independent. So if that's an assumption that you're making, right, that we only are going to see these tactical innovations coming out of these strongly organized dissident groups, then I think you could simplify your hypothesis quite a bit. So removing one of these concepts or the other. And as I'll mention in just a minute, I think that'll actually get you closer to what you're testing empirically. Okay. So as I mentioned, I really like that you bring a lot of empirical tests to bear on the research question. So there's a quantitative test, there's a qualitative discussion, and there's a nice use of out-of-sample forecasting here. So my second comment is going to focus on your time series test, again, as it relates to that hypothesis that I just sort of mentioned from page 8. So I'm not sure that you're testing the hypothesis that you think you're testing here, or at least the one that you're outlining on page 8, for a couple of reasons. First, there's no measure of change in dissident tactics in this time series test. So the test only looks at the effect of a change in government tactics, for whatever reason, on dissident activity. Second, at least as it's currently written up, I don't think there's any variance in the strength of the organization of the dissident group. So that seems to be held constant. As far as I can tell, the Turkish opposition are constant in their organizational strength. So the empirics seem to be testing the direct effect of policing and decapitation, both in isolation and in combination with one another on dissident activity. You're not really testing the effect of changes in dissident tactics, conditional on changes in government tactics, conditional on the strength of dissident organizational structure, conditional on the extent to which repression targets leadership, which was your hypothesis. You're actually empirically testing a much simpler hypothesis, which I think is cleaner than your hypothesis as currently stated in the theoretical section of the paper. So I would encourage you to think a little bit about, pushing toward testing this cleaner hypothesis and discussing that cleaner hypothesis theoretically. Okay, and then my last comment is also to push you on this match between your theory and empirics, and hopefully this, other folks will have some ideas about how to do this. So you do a really nice job in the theory about talking about the endogenous nature of repression and dissent, and then the implications of that endogeneity for building the theory. But once you move to the empirics, we kind of stop accounting for that endogeneity. So what I'm concerned about is that the repression intervention you have here is not exogenous to dissent. So not only is it not exogenous to dissent, part of your theory is to explicitly argue that that repression intervention occurs in response to dissent. But your empirical model treats that intervention as if it's exogenous. So how to deal with this? One option would be to keep your current test and do some sort of fancy econometrics to try to account for the endogeneity. And again, hopefully we can talk about some ideas for that as the discussion goes on. But as another option, I think, it would be neat to see another test in the paper. Well, what you need is a test where repressive tactics change for a reason that is theoretically unrelated to dissent. So I don't know, maybe you can find an example where we see repressive tactics changing due to an economic crisis or something like that, I don't know. But you really need a treatment variable that's going to be uncorrelated with your main dependent variable here. And since you're theoretically arguing that the repression intervention is occurring in response to dissent, I'm not sure that the way that you're currently modeling this is capturing the fact that we know that this is an endogenous relationship and dealing with it appropriately. But again, I think the paper is really, really interesting, really, really cool theoretically. I would just encourage you to think a little bit about how you might be able to make some explicit assumptions in your theory that would allow you to have a better match between your theoretical hypothesis and then the way that you've set up your empirical tests. So thanks for letting me read. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. These are great. Thank you.
Eric.
Alrighty, well, thanks Tijen for the opportunity to read this paper, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion. I think there are things that are done very well here. The first is, as Courtney mentioned, you have this really great assemblage of information that you have been able to cull from news sources that are in the Turkish language, and it's really fantastic. It's a great question. It's a super important question. It has really direct implications for the way people think about movement building and movement resilience. And because of that, I think, you know, it sort of passes the so what test as a research question goes. I agree with Courtney that you have a terrific combination of methodological approaches that you bring to bear here. I'd like the autoregressive approach followed by the out-of-sample validation approach, and then nice discussion of the unfolding of this particular campaign. I also really think you did a great job putting together some really informative data visualizations, and just think that the graphs that you produce are really useful and well put together. And I think too that it's a fairly intuitive argument, so that, you know, there wouldn't be too many, I think, movement activists who would read this paper and then say, well, you know, this doesn't resonate with some of our experience, you know. So for that reason, I think that it passes the common sense test as well, which is really useful. I have a few things for you to think about that I think the paper would be really strengthened in addressing. The first and the one that struck me by the time I was through the first paragraph on the first page was just the question of who is this paper for? And the reason I was thinking about that is just because the way that it reads at the front end of the paper, it reads like you're going to talk about ways that governments can demobilize, nascent nonviolent movements. Toward the end of the paper, the way that you frame the findings, you're sort of like, this is really important for nonviolent campaigns to know. But I think that it would be useful to pick a frame and stick to it. And if you're going to pick the frame of, here's how governments effectively demobilize nonviolent movements, there's a much more in-depth ethical justification that I'd like to see for why that should be the way that this study would be set up and oriented. And likewise, if it's for nonviolent movements, to think about how best to put together their strategy. I think that there are strong ethical concerns about kind of drawing certain implications from historical studies, particularly when it deals with a single case that might be generalizable for other movements. And so I would just really appreciate seeing a few paragraphs on what you think are the sort of moral and ethical commitments that you have that are motivating your interest in this work, and then how you think that the research should be taken. I mean, clearly it's instructive for governments, but it can also be instructive for movements, but in what way and to what effect? The second thing that I was thinking about is that much of the paper, I think, is quite consistent with some of the findings that Christopher Sullivan developed in his work on the way that the Guatemalan military basically dismantled leftist opposition groups before the Civil War and then during the Civil War. And, you know, his basic argument was similar in the sense that when there is sort of targeted and selective repression combined with a dismantling of the support networks, combined with different types of divide and rule strategies, that, you know, governments have been really good at making it impossible for mobilization to continue in a nonviolent way. And then there's another article by Jonathan Sutton, Charles Butcher, and Isak Svensson that talks about organizational infrastructure as being the key kind of intervening variable in determining whether one-sided violence ends up demobilizing a movement or not, a nonviolent movement. So I think your argument that you're making is quite consistent with those, and if you can engage with those pieces a little bit more to say how your piece is sort of advancing something that is adding to those conversations, I think would be very useful. And for me, the main distinction for you is that you're talking about this this tactical innovation argument as being testable, and I think that that could be a really useful hook for you to distinguish what you're doing here from what Chris has done and what Jonathan, Charles, and Isak have done. One of the things that struck me about the match between the government's interventions that you're interested in, particularly the move to a decapitation strategy and the dismantling of the support network, is that you're testing sort of discrete government turns or interventions against essentially events data, right? And you're talking about tactical innovation. The two main tactical innovations that you talk about are the Standing Man protests and the sort of collective conversations that were taking place. To me, the Standing Man protests don't feel like a tactical innovation because it's still protest. A tactical innovation to me feels like, just like the government would change its strategy or change its overall approach toward repression, in this case, a movement would change its overall approach as well. So it wouldn't be just changing from one type of protest to another, but it would be changing from protest to, as you cite, methods of dispersion, like doing strikes or doing stayaways, or actually the conversation, that the sort of collectives that you described might be actually more of a tactical innovation than Standing Man protest. So I would just, I think, encourage you to be a little more explicit in the text early on about what qualifies as a tactical innovation and what the literature says about that. I actually think the literature is very vague about what would actually qualify as a tactical innovation. So in that sense alone, you can make a really nice contribution to it as well. Another thing that you say is that, let's see. Yeah. I think one of my overall points was just that this idea that you have kind of a discrete change in government strategy and not so much in the movement. And so that would be something to look at. One more thing I would mention is that in the conclusion on page 24, you talk about the findings as offering an alternative causal mechanism for demobilization, demonstrating that tactical adaptation by the government in response to tactical innovation by the movement can demobilize the movement. But my sense is that tactical innovation by the government really at any point can demobilize a movement, right? So it doesn't have to just be in response to the movement innovating something. Governments often come out and try to take the initiative and devise new techniques of repression in anticipation of having to face down a movement that's maybe creative or inspired by, a movement nearby. So I'm really curious about the sort of transnational dimension of the Gezi Park experience. And this is just, the fact that it's occurring in the context of a broader kind of global diffusion of these activities. And there was explicit reference to that, both by the movement and by Erdogan, right? I mean, Erdogan was talking about this is a soft coup, this is like a color revolution, it's part of this wave. He accused the activists of being conspirators that were in cahoots with the West. Very much the sort of typical authoritarian or semi-authoritarian toolkit of delegitimizing movements, and he used a very familiar suite of repressive tactics to put this movement down. So, part of the question is this really tactical innovation in response to the movement, or is it just a new kind of repertoire of repression that is shared widely among authoritarians and semi-authoritarians? I would echo what Courtenay brought up about the organizational capacity story. I agree with you. I think that I'm largely convinced that movements that have better organizational infrastructure are going to be much more durable and resilient than those without. But as Courtenay brought up too, it's really difficult to disentangle that as kind of an intervening factor when actually it can be quite related to both repression and the choice of tactics. The last thing I'll mention is just that 72 observations is pretty small for being able to produce, stable statistical findings. And so the only thing this makes me think of is whether there's an ability to sort of expand the series into additional years of contention in Turkey, or whether it would make sense to pull in a couple of comparative cases that you could then actually get at the organizational infrastructure variation, if that was something that varied across the different cases that you were interested in. So with that, I think I will set aside any remaining thoughts and turn it over to Katrin.
Actually, Tijen, there's already a lot brought up, so I thought maybe you want to jump in and then we move to Katrin. Is that fine?
Sure. So, Erica and Courtney, thank you so much. These are awesome comments. So, and very, very helpful in terms of thinking, making me think how to move forward. But one of the things that I want to go back to, first, let me start with Courtney. So I see what you're saying with the hypothesis. And actually, while you were talking about this, I realized that I have the cleaner version. But it doesn't really come across as much because I did frame it more in terms of tactical innovation. It is actually the tactical adaptation. It's the government's adaptation that I'm looking at, because my argument is that the literature generally looks at innovations. And or that was the literature that was based on the civil rights movement, but actually, and that kind of puts more agency in the protesters than the government, and the government is seen generally as the the party that responds and doesn't take the initiative. And what I'm saying is that's not really always the case. The government, as Erica just said, takes the initiative, and and even when there is the tactical innovation, it can still, tactical innovation doesn't always increase support to campaigns. So it can still, even in those cases, just crush the movement. So, so it is actually more focused. It is focused on government adaptation, so to say, and I realized that I need to make that a lot clearer, and clearly that didn't come across very clearly. But in terms of the organizational and the organizational thing, it's the how do I disentangle that? It is something that I've also struggled, and I don't know in terms of how do I necessarily maybe comparative case study would be great, except that would take another couple of years to collect the data, because there's not as detailed or micro level data as I'm using in this case. And so I've been struggling with that, and so I will think more about that and see what else I can do. And in terms of okay, so what was so, and then I will simplify the hypothesis. And the other Erica's point in terms of the moral, the moral and ethical aspects of this. So at some point when I was working on this, I'm like, am I writing a how to crush movements handbook here? But and it's very troubling that I'm actually finding the key for success in this case in the Gezi campaign. But I also need to, I guess I need to figure out how to turn the table a little bit and, you know, write it more towards the activists, because that's my moral and ethical commitment. I do not obviously think that, you know, crushing the movements like this is a you know, is a good thing, and I would not want the governments to learn any lessons from this. But it's also hard to stay neutral in that regard, you know. And I don't know if I don't want to be also in a situation where I'm putting too much of my ethical and moral commitment, and, you know, kind of like maybe be seen as I'm my approach to this is already biased from the beginning. So I guess I mean, if that makes any sense, I don't know. So I need to think about that, how to make it more towards the, you know, like kind of plug in that this is not something that the government should do without really being seen as I'm biased in any way. And the, you know, Christopher Sullivan and Butcher, Svensson, and Isaac, I'm very familiar with those pieces. Yes, I should integrate those more. And I think you're right. The tactical innovation and adaptation, you know, interaction is a nice hook for me to capitalize on. And so, in terms of standing man, that's an interesting question, because you know, obviously tactical innovation is very context related too. So is this something in the, you know, previous repertoire of those movements, of those activists that you know, that are engaged in this? Is that something that that has never been used in that context? For instance, is more or less how I thought about or the literature made me think about tactical innovations. And I think you know, when you look at the civil rights movements, the civil rights campaign, I'm not, you know, you're right. There was a more of a like major shift in terms of the type of tactics used. But in terms of the Gezi campaign, it was, I saw it as a tactical innovation because it was a move towards like active to passive. And, you know, protests are still some kind of, you know, you have to, you know, you're striking, you're coming together. It's very much, it's more a collective form, whereas the standing man protests were more of a, you know, extremely passive, and they were just standing. So I, you know, saw that as a, you know, significant shift from the existing tactic towards, you know, which was more engaged, you know, was required more engagement and more effort and more collectivity, to a more passive and just you know, almost individual type of tactic. So but you're right, the literature doesn't really give me too much of a guideline here, so I might, you know, think about how to make it more you know, explicit, and see, you know, if and think about it, you know, because this is something that I hadn't thought about before. And yeah, and you're right, the you know, causal mechanism here, in terms of the causal mechanism, I agree, obviously, that the, you know, government takes initiative anytime. But I think in this case, what I was trying to highlight was more of the fact that, you know, even though we think tactical innovation is something that would fuel the campaign, because, you know, like the literature, including, you know, your why nonviolence or civil resistance works, makes the argument that if you have broader segments of the society, and if you know, when you have more people who, you know, have also different backgrounds, and then they start to innovate from different corners, then the government will not necessarily be able to use, you know, like, then the government is going to be having a harder time to figure out how to repress. And then if they repress with violence, then obviously they're going to be, you know, seen as more, you know, it's going to be seen illegitimate. So what I'm saying here is that tactical adaptation innovations, even in the case of tactical innovations, I guess that's the context that I'm putting. And so it's not about if the government takes the initiative, but it's more about even when the campaign seems like it's on its course to have a, you know, broader support and escalate because it's committed to nonviolence, and it's because innovating new tactics, and still the government can, even in those cases, you know, before the, you know, military takes side, or before the government is seen completely illegitimate, or the repression is completely seen illegitimate, they can just still crush it. That's the context that I was looking at. But clearly I need to phrase this then a lot more clearly, since this didn't come through. So I guess that's, yes.
I had two fingers, which doesn't equal a one. So these are short comments. So Erica's sensitivity to the tactical innovation thing, right? So I think the social movement people are just very much committed to the kind of McAdam setup on the phrase, and it doesn't necessarily resonate much outside of that particular community. So you might mention it a little bit clearer. Like, I don't think you use the active passive distinction in the paper, right? So you were just mentioning it right there was very helpful for getting some sense of where that distinction was. And because I was like, when you said the standing man, I'm just like, well, people weren't standing during the protest before. How is that an innovation, right? So, but that's because I was influenced by Clark McPhail's work. And so Clark McPhail disaggregates, so this is a two in the sense this is more of a quick question. I think what you did was you aggregated each kind of collective event and then viewed it as a single thing. Like, okay, there was a protest. And so however many people that were at a particular place and time counted as a single event. But then later on, when you talk about the standing man, you've then disaggregated that single event. And now you're looking at what individuals are doing in a particular place. And so that seemed like that needed to be consistent in order to kind of get at the same point. Because McPhail makes you do exactly what you did, which is like you go to a single place and time, and you're looking at what everyone is doing individually and collectively. And so you kind of mix those, and so that threw me off. The moral position thing, I'm just like, that's a big issue, right? I mean, so there's part of our profession that is about helping governments kill challengers. You know, GTD. I mean, there's a bunch of people who are out there just trying to help. They're trying to help challengers take on governments. I mean, so it's hard to kind of like weigh that out. I always love the rebel's dilemma in the sense that if you were a challenger, right, you could read the rebel's dilemma and come away with, okay, I know now how best to take out the government. And if you're a government, you could read the rebel's dilemma and you'd be like, okay, I know how best now to take out the challengers. I mean, so Mark was extremely clear on like trying to just lay things out and be neutral. And so I think that's hard. I mean, I got static for even my book title, How Social Movements Die. People were just like, what, you're against movements? I'm like, whoa, that wasn't my point. And so I think sometimes you can't be that clear with regards to which way the language is going. But Katrin.
Okay, I'm Katrin Paula from University of Mannheim. Yeah, there was a lot said about what to like at the paper. I will add 2 points here, and I like that it really has this micro perspective and the microdynamics and really goes into the case, and also that you collect data on that level. I think this is really a selling point for the kind of stuff if you want to look into this interaction between 2 actors. I will add a bit to what said. I was thinking about similar lines. So one thing I was just thinking about when it came up is why should you take out leaders and hurt them? So this was like the strategy then that was pursued, you assume, if they're weak anyways. So how, like, what is the exact mechanism here? So it goes a bit in this direction. And I was thinking, okay, if it's about technical innovation, is there no creativity for invention? Is there no creative capacity there for new tactics if you take out these persons out of the games?
Unmute.
So,
Okay. No. Okay. Is this a question for me then?
no, I think it was. I think I went on with the discussion comments, or is it?
Yeah. No. I was.
But you can answer, of course. But I would have like, or is it the spread of the new intervention or of the new innovation? So is it more about that these people kind of then diffuse it through the network, or is it more about that it's a strong signal in general that you have an innovation? In this case, it would not be that necessary that the people kind of are arrested but then come out of arrest again. So I think this would be like 3 options to challenge just how this could work. And the other question goes a bit like to the direction of what Erica was saying. So I was just wondering whether there is kind of a standard protocol how the Turkish government acts for these kind of stuff. So maybe it tries to solve the protests on the streets first, and then afterwards, if there are more resources freed, so to say, you go into raids or stuff like this. So you mentioned in the text that you checked this kind of with the innovation of the protest tactics. You looked into, or there was a paper looking into other protests, and there you didn't see the standing man at the forum. And I was just wondering whether you could maybe look at that protest again and see whether the Turkish government there also kind of started to raid at some point, so like this innovation of, or this adaptation of the government tactic. Is it like a general pattern the Turkish government just uses when there's a protest coming up, or was it specific to the Gezi part? I mean, I think you could have some leverage here if you prove that with an older case. And the third thing I just was thinking about, and this goes a bit to what Courtenay says, to dine like the theory more to the empirics. So what you have is like this time series over 72 days, and then you code the intervention, and then you have the intervention coded as 1. And I think this is quite a vulnerable point in the paper in the sense of that it would be very easy for reviewers to come up with an alternative explanation what happened in the last time here. So it could be that the summer break of the semester started, and since you have a lot of students out there, it's just, if I think this is the mechanism, I code the same time period. Or what could also be the case is that, for example, like as far as I can remember, the Gezi Park protests, the park was cleared on June 15th, and this might be a very strong signal for the movement that the symbolic place they kind of captured for so long was now recaptured by the government. So this could really kind of be a strong signal that the movement is weak. And the police also closed down the park afterwards. So maybe this was the intervention, and then I would code it the same way. So I think this is a thing you might want to think about. And then I thought about what could you do with the data you have. And you could either take, for example, Istanbul out and say whether it works, see whether it still has the same trend. Or what you also could do, or I'm not sure, but maybe it would be a possibility. You said that you also have the locations of the events coded. So I was wondering whether it's possible to come up with, let's say, a city day panel. So a city unbalanced panel, sorry. So a city enters the panel once it starts protesting, so it's on the government's kind of monitor that there's potential for mobilization. And then once the city enters, you just have like the counts on each day in this city. And since you also said that you had variation when the arrests began, time-wise, but also, as far as I can remember, there was variation where they started first or where they were placed locationally. I think you could really tie this a bit more with this, or might be possible to get more to theory. So you could think about like the count of the decapitation events in a city and see whether this then really decreases protest events, or if a city starts with a standing man protest, but there is no decapitation strategy there, does the protest hold the level? Or what is the time between the tactical innovations of the standing man protest and the reaction of the government? And if this time is shorter, then it should be demobilized faster, I would say. And you could even look maybe if there is a global or a local effect, in the sense of is the total number of decapitation events that drives the decrease of protest in each city, or is it more the local one within the city? So it's just a suggestion. I'm not sure whether you can do it with the data, but it might help you to get a bit more to that interaction here. So this was so far what I had.
Courtney had 2 before you respond.
Yeah, so I just wanted to echo, I totally agree with Katrin's comment here about the vulnerability of coding the intervention as a 1 and then continuing to code it as a 1 throughout the rest of the series. I think she gave you some really good suggestions for how to deal with that. One thing I was going to say is that there's another potential problem with this strategy, at least if I understand your data correctly. So you interact your intervention, which is decapitation, with policing, which is another tactic. And so one of the things that I think if you continue with this, this strategy of coding the intervention as a 1 and then continuing to code it as a 1 is that you really need to be clear that somewhere in your data, decapitation is used on its own without being used in combination with policing. So one of the implications of the interaction between decapitation and policing is that if decapitation never occurs without policing also occurring in any of the units of observation in your data, then it's going to be really hard for you to disentangle the independent effect of decapitation, which is what you're really interested in. And so given what I imagine your data looks like, I think you're drawing conclusions for that independent effect of decapitation, probably with not very many observations where it's a 1 on decapitation and a 0 on policing. So just a sort of another reason to rethink this strategy and potentially move in the way that Katrin suggested.
So I had 2. I had 2s as well. So part of that was the decapitation point, right? So, so much of the kind of leadership decapitation literature I know, some of the terrorism stuff, but also related to counterinsurgency, also related to protest policing. It seemed as if you were trying to suggest, because later on, wait, we have to incorporate that. It's like at a certain point, everyone needs to go back and just be like, and then we get back to it. Okay, so I think this it's an interesting dynamic in the sense that you kind of talk about there not being structure to the particular campaign, and yet you want to talk about leadership decapitation. So I couldn't figure out, I'm just like, if there's really no organizational base to the campaign where everybody's showing up that is connected to an organization, and you just have some people that are showing up to the different locations themselves that are not connected to the movement, then what is their connection to the leader? Why would they be responding to a leader being decapitated? This is a very different logic than everyone is around Fidel or some other kind of like social movement leader and that leader disappears and then people respond to it. And so this differentiates it from the demobilization that I focus on in my book, which is like, it is a specific social movement organization. We are looking at how the people that are members of that organization basically are responding to perturbances coming from the state. The other thing was the way to deal with the kind of smallish n issue was, I mean, right now you're pooling all the events to a day, right? So you're getting like n number of events in a day, but it seems like you might have information on each individual event. So if that's the case, then why not make the event specific kind of like characteristics important? And then you're basically looking at, you'd have n number of locations that are just iterated over time rather than the pooling. And then you have the events at those particular locations, because you might not, individuals in one location might not be responding to the oppression of another one, right? So it seems like if you have event specific information, then if you use that, then your n will increase significantly. But that was also my 2 finger. And Erica, so the two's concatenating. We never get to it. But E, go ahead.
Actually, was there somebody else who was going to finish that point? Because I really do have a one finger, I think.
Oh, you're a one? We were just going to go to Tijen if you wanted to respond to any of that, and then we can go back to ones.
Perfect.
Okay. So, yeah, thank you, Katrina. Well, you know, one of the things that I was trying to get out of the alternative explanations, you know, because it's an intervention model, and I realize that it's 1, 0. You know, it's a maybe too simplistic, but I was trying to do that with the auto forecasting models. Actually, the whole idea of especially the first one, is what would have happened if decapitation never happened? Like, how would the protest campaign be predicted to go? And that's, you know, and the predictions indicate that it would have been escalating. And so the other, you know, model, then the other auto forecasting predicts, like, if, you know, after was there anything else that would have, like, if policing, for instance, was so useful, it was more influential, for instance, after the decapitation, do we still would this have been seen, you know, would we have seen, or if decapitation was not influential, then would we have seen a demobilization still or not? And the model predicts demobilization. But I realize that this might be maybe just still, you know, not accounting for some of the other you know, alternative mechanisms that Katrina mentioned. But, you know, I think the location and seeing if there are cities where they didn't have decapitation but had standing man protests, for instance, or vice versa, like those, I could think about those, and that might, you know, that might be an interesting way of getting at that. And in terms of the decapitation, so okay, that's another thing that I was worried about, or like have been, you know, looking forward to getting your input in that. I know decapitation is seen as, you know, the literature you know, suggests that decapitation is going after the leaders. Well, in this case, you know, I kind of framed it a little bit more of a broader going after, and you know, because there are those more active activists that go to, you know, that are in the front lines, versus those activists that, you know, maybe you know, are drawn into this, but are not necessarily always going to, you know, they're more in the fringes. But then there are also support networks. There are for instance, the nurses that have makeshift clinics there, and the doctors. And then there are, you know, some other groups that provide some services there. And then there are the families. So, you know, what I'm talking about here in terms of decapitation refers more to the going after the people and scaring their, you know, network system, their families, and going after them, giving them the signal that we know who you are. You know, you may not have a leader in this regard, but we know who you are, and we're going to get you eventually. The problem is I couldn't come up with a name that you know, that kind of, or a term that like labels this, other than decapitation. You know, that was my challenge a little bit. So I'm totally open to suggestion, you know, in that regard.
Yeah, my two quickly is like, so this sounds more like selective violence, right? So you've seen those protest policing tactics where they come in with a wedge, they open it, and then they grab someone, take them back out, wedge closes, and then it pulls back out. I mean, so this tactic is fine. My thing is like, and going after active activists, I guess it really gets back to this whole issue of like, who are the people at the events you're talking about? If everyone at the event knows one another already, they know who the leader is, and so when that person is removed, then that's likely to kind of resonate through the crowd. And they're just like, hey, you know, Sally's gone. You know, that's one thing. But if it's someone shows up, someone gets arrested, but many people that are present at the event don't know who that person was, they're not going to be affected. I mean, so if this thing is really rooted around organizations, then it makes sense that someone knows about someone's family or someone knows about the bank or some other kind of support staff. But if a bunch of, if it's a convenience sample of individuals just popping up to this geographic location, then they're not going to know the family members, they're not going to know the network. And so you needed to kind of get me there, because I didn't feel like I had a sense of who was at the events, to get a sense of that coherence, so that I know that when they're perturbed by some repressive activities, I know how it resonates through the community. And so your model, for example, the figure, it didn't really, so when you say mobilization, I mean, so my book, I go through, that means there's individuals, there's organizations, there's bystanders, and then there's just participants in action. And these four things could overlap, or they're separate. And so I don't quite get which configuration you have, because the guy who innovated, I forget his name, sorry, but the guy who innovated the standing man approach, I'm like, okay, so what was his relationship to any organization, right? What was his relationship to the other people that were present there? If someone else started to also stand like him, and the movement is, and then that tactic is then diffused to another individual, I'm like, okay, so, but if no one has a personal relationship to that individual, if he gets like cracked in the head or maced in the face or something like that, then that's a different effect that you would expect on the viewing audience or the people connected to him. So I guess I needed more of a sense of the coherence of these different events and who was present. So it's and then this relates to kind of, so what you mean by mobilization relates to what you get to for demobilization. So demobilization for me was, the members stopped coming, our tactics no longer used, the objectives of the organization changed, fundamentally moderated, or just completely stopped. And so your sense of mobilization informs what we think of as demobilization. So, you know, Wendy Perlman's got a different view on this, right? I mean, there's different ways to kind of house that. This is what I mean by mobilization. This is what I mean by demobilization. And so I think you needed some kind of clarity in the parsing to get us to how those two are related, because I didn't come away. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because like, because Will was present actually at these events, running around at the same time, and so it's so I was actually paying more attention than I would to be normally to kind of the protest events that were taking place and what was taking place in different locations. But the thing I remember that I was constantly looking for was who are these people? And you list them, right? So I'm just like, are the students connected to the other organizations? Are there organizations? I mean, okay, they're students, right? But is it a student organization, or is it just students? And so that became, oh, you don't need to raise your finger. It's your session, so yeah.
Well, so this is an interesting question, because actually, for instance, the individual who started the Standing Man protest, he was an individual. He was not related to any organization, and the students were not organized. You know, like for instance, it would be something like, you know, there would be a major protest campaign in Indianapolis, which will probably not happen anytime soon. But like, I would be just going there and seeing, oh, you know, my students are there too. It was like that, you know, people were not doing that because they were members of organizations. Some were union, you know, people, and they joined. They decided as an organization to join, but they did not coordinate with other organizations. And so, like, they did not coordinate with the with the students, saying that, okay, we are going all out today, kind of stuff. And so the way I saw this as it was happening was, you know, yes, maybe people did not necessarily know each other, but then when the government's tactic worked in the sense that when the government said, you know, okay, like there were dawn police operations the next day, for instance, in the newspapers, and people were saying, like, you know, 35 people that were at the protests were arrested and their families were brought in, that kind of showed the signal, gave the signal to the general population who was willing to participate, but wasn't an organization member. So, and we always talk about the lower threshold of participation when there are more and more people participating. But when something happened to these people, that threshold suddenly got higher.
Yeah, so this may, and Erica's work definitely speaks to this a little bit better, right? But I'm thinking of like the Carl Dater ops work, Op and Rule, because they talk about, but that's social networks, right? So when someone else was repressed, it's that person is, okay, we went to church together, or we're both student. I mean, there's some connection, there's some affiliation, and so if you can get at the affiliation and kind of like network, because 35 people might be arrested, but if you don't feel like those are your people or you're connected with them, you're just like, oh, okay, they must have been doing something criminally bad, right? So then you just kind of like step back. But the idea to which the diversity becomes interesting from my perspective that way, because it's also timing, right? So someone who shows up initially is perhaps a different type of person than someone who shows up after some repression has taken place, because people are showing up at that point. That person's risk acceptant. That person is probably not going to be perturbed by more tear gas because they saw the tear gas the first time and yet they still showed up. And so I think as the protest rolls out across space and people are coming, I think you can integrate that aspect of the dynamism, because the late arrivers are aware of what's going to happen, right? So their cost function is probably a little bit different than the person who first shows up and like they're not sure what's going to happen. And so the sequential dynamics seem to be useful to play in there. I think Oliver and Myers kind of talk about this in this co-evolutionary sense, and you kind of hinted that, and then you kind of step away from it later on. But Q, open. E.
Yeah, so Tijen, I wanted to go back to this question of how do you classify innovation? Or actually, in a way, what has to be done first is just classifying tactics. In a similar way to the way that you classified government strategies, right? So, there's a couple ways to splice it. You brought up this distinction between active and passive. There's another distinction Gene Sharp makes between commission and omission, which are acts that, commission is what you're not expected to do, that you do anyway, and omission is when you withdraw consent and cooperation with things that you were expected to do. So that would be more the boycotts, the strikes, the stayaways. Commission is protest of any kind. Then there's another distinction sometimes made in the literature between the one that you mentioned, between dispersion and concentration, which is more of a spatial categorization. And I think actually you have a great opportunity to actually come up with a way to effectively classify tactics here. And then that would then allow you to demonstrate when there was a real shift or when there was a real innovation, when they're moving from one box to another, and the types of tactics that you identify. So the people I think that have made the most distinctions conceptually around these are Gene Sharp, but also Kurt Schock does that. And I've done that a little bit. I can send you a table that I've put together for a working paper that kind of differentiates along two dimensions, the concentration, dispersion, and commission, omission, because there are different risks associated with those different categorizations. There are different mobilization potentials in terms of participation potential. There's differences in terms of the opportunity costs and all kinds of things. So, so that, I think that's, if you are really wanting to focus on tactical innovation and then tactical adaptation by the government or strategic adaptation, depending on which level of analysis you decide you want to wind up with, I think that classification would be really great and useful as a contribution both to the scholarship on this, but also for people that are trying to do it.
Thank you.
Oh, Tijen, I thought you were going to respond. Related, there's a piece, I'm trying to remember the other authors, but Ring Ramirez is the only one that occurs to me right now. They have this great piece on repertoire and diffusion, where effectively they identify the mechanism of diffusion as being a function of people being co-present where particular events take place, where tactics happen, and then the individuals that are there, as they go on with their own network and interacting with other people, they then start to kind of utilize these tactics that they've been able to kind of like witness and experience in some way, shape, or form. So you're able to kind of map that out. My thing is, and you hint at it up front, right? A little bit when you start referencing kind of like Will and Steve Shellman stuff and getting at the kind of repression dissent nexus dynamic. So then I'm like, oh, okay. And then you're using some like autoaggressive stuff. I'm just like, okay, here we're gonna get both sides. And then you still kind of like just look at one side and then it's perturbed by the governments. So you weren't giving me both sides. So I was kind of like, I kind of want you to go the co-evolutionary route. That'll also increase your end. That'll also increase like the number of actors you're paying attention to, but you kind of talk about it a little bit. It's like, so I start to get the sense of the protesters kicking off in different locations, and then tactics are starting in some locations and others. I don't get the same sense of what the government is doing, because I kind of lose the government in your, at that point, your focus you kind of come out in the sense of, okay, who you're really talking about. And then you start using the loaded language, right? You got like harsh and excessive with regards to kind of protest, and you never use that with regards to the challengers. So the language reveals which way you actually feel. So I'm like, either balance that or like take it out. But I kind of wanted the government side, because I was like, well, is the government responding? Are they following? If you just had like a simple map, and it's like, okay, first it was here, then it was here, then it was there, then it was there. And then you could do something similar to kind of like how the protesters are being followed by the police or preemptively. I think that would be very useful for me, kind of following the events of what you were talking about. But related to that, I mean, this isn't exactly relevant to your piece, and I'm not sure if you have data on it or not, but I thought about it immediately. There's a constant presumption in our literature that you have two distinct sides. There's challengers and there's governments. But what I got from my RNA book was, well, we know, and David Cunningham, the sociologist, not the political scientist, talks about this as well, right? We know the governments have informants and provocateurs and so forth in the challenging group, which eliminates that twofold power thing, because someone might innovate something that we think is part of the movement, but they're actually part of the government. And so once you go that route, then you really have to challenge, or really have to think about what's innovative, who's coming up with what, for what reason are people coming up with it. And now the government is now perhaps given a justification for responding in a particular way because of this new tactic that came out of nowhere. Mm-hmm. Hold it. Wait for it. Too cool. Okay, thanks, E. I'm sorry about that. But yeah, so and Courtenay.
Okay, so this is a two-finger on Erica's comment, and then I think the first part of Christian's comment. So the way, as far as like figuring out how to repackage this, Tijen, I think you have, I see three potential options, right? So one is something that one is to go the strategic route, right? Take into account that, right, tactical adjustments by dissidents lead to tactical adjustments by the government. And I think that's really theoretically interesting. It puts you in a position where, as I mentioned before, your empirical test isn't testing that, right? So Christian gave you some ideas for how you might test that. It's a more interesting theoretical contribution. It's a more difficult empirical test. So that's one option. The second option, right, and you sort of alluded to this early in your comments, is to look just at government tactical adjustment, right? Government tactical adjustment. And that puts you in a world where if you can find some sort of an exogenous shock to government that leads to government tactical adjustment, right? And you might even be able to find this in your data. If you have something that you think is a government tactically adjusting, not in response to a dissident tactical adjustment, then you might be able to test just this part of your theory that is about government tactical adjustment, right? And be able to look at government tactical adjustment conditional on leadership capacity of the opposition group, which I think is a really cool contribution, right? So a third option, Erica's comment to like do some of the same things that you did in disaggregating government tactics with opposition tactics. I like that idea a lot. I think there's been more work on that, right? So as far as bang for your buck, I think I might do 2 papers here. One, I might look at the effect of government tactical adjustment on dissident mobilization and try to find some empirical test where you can argue that government tactical adjustment is exogenous to dissident protest, right? And then you could look at the conditionalities that you said you have in your simple hypothesis. And then longer term, I might take on this bigger question of government tactical adjustment in response to dissident tactical adjustment, which is a really cool theoretical issue, but not something that your current empirical tests are really giving you much leverage over. So anyway, just as far as like moving forward and thinking about how to package some of the comments here, I think those are potential routes that you could take.
Tijen, do you want to respond? We could just keep rolling.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Courtenay. I really appreciate that because, that puts things a little bit more like, when we are talking about all of these things, it is also like one part of my brain is thinking like, how am I going to do all of these in 10,000 words? Because I mean, there is a very rich and interesting case material there because the case is really interesting. I think, but then also the theory is to me very interesting as well, and how the case defies some of the theoretical assumption is interesting. But there's a lot going on, and it is really maybe 2 papers. I can see that. So yes, thank you.
Some coding things, you might still be able to get at it. And so I don't think that the moment has passed per se. So there's kind of an event focus to a lot of stuff. But I wonder about things like a curfew, right? So it's like a curfew is not necessarily an event. It's more like a change in condition. It's a ramp up, and like, so nothing like that was applied at the same time. And so if that was applied, so like curfews in Northern Ireland, right? They not only specified a particular like time period that things weren't supposed to happen, but they specifically identified a particular geographic location where these things weren't supposed to happen. So is there anything like a curfew that's being enacted by the government? No. Or anything like that. I guess I was thinking more in the sense of not, because the event focus of kind of autoaggressive dynamics gets you to think about one thing, but you kind of miss some kind of like phase shifts that kind of, like the court passes something, a political leader does something, and that applies over a space. The second thing was kind of these were kind of like things that I thought could have been addressed in many respects. So if you take some of the kind of principal agent repression stuff that comes out, because right now you kind of have this unified model for the state, right? And I'm like, is it fair to assume, you don't really address this explicitly with the discussion of the security force apparatus, but is it fair to assume that all of the police responses that are taking place at the individual events are actually coordinated? And so from that perspective, this is kind of speaking to some of Erica's stuff about defection, but it's like, or this is speaking to the whole issue of someone going rogue, right? The way you have it set up right now, governments are coordinated in a way that is also in line with how you think challengers are coordinated, but at the same time, you suggest that there's no structure to it. So it's like, it was a weird kind of balance for me. It's because it's like, why would you be perturbed by some protest activity being repressed if you know these people, you know connection with them? And so back to my like little network thing, which I think would be useful. And I kind of had to do it because it's normally standard, and that was my other book on media bias, right? So I'm just like, you mentioned the source, and then you mentioned that you don't think it's biased, but the point of the book was it identified the idea of perspective, and that was a source covers events, not to cover all events, but it covers events for a particular reason, and that reason informs what you can extract out of the source. But I don't know what this source, who their audience is. I don't know, are they politically left? Are they right? where are they? Who are they writing news for? Because from that perspective, you wouldn't expect information to come out. And I always say this, and it was kind of like the message is kind of just not taken. But if information matters and if perspective matters, which I think the bargaining model is based on this, right? So then it should matter for whom is a source writing for information. And we shouldn't be pooling information, actually. We should be keeping it separate because a source is writing for its audience, and that's informing its audience's position. So could you give me some sense of who is the newspaper being written for and who is their audience? Because that kind of, I think, informs the pool of information that would be there to code.
So the audience is the, secular leftist, anti-Erdogan crowd, and so one of the reasons that I did use this is that they say they are the most independent, and they're not. The media is in Turkey obviously under severe threat and has been for a while. So this is still the most independent source. They are not. They're not associated with the government. A lot of media sources are actually either very visibly related to the government because they're the government's media outlets, and some of them have been on and off. And depending on the editors and depending on the relationship to the owner, because Erdogan sometimes is friends with somebody and then is not anymore. So this newspaper has been consistently the same, has been pursuing this middle of the line kind of. We are not associated with anybody, but their audience is more the secular left.
So in line with that, I think it would be interesting to see what the voice of the government has to say.
Yeah, yeah.
In many respects, you might think they might be better at covering dissident activity, not necessarily state repressive activity, but they're just like, okay, things are horrible, or they're trying to communicate to people that they're in charge, in which case they're going to give you more information about repression and less relative to that.
Yes, and that was going to be my, next project. It's just, again, with the data collection being so, labor intensive, I just went with the first one in this one, and partly because it's also, I was thinking if I use a more, independent, so-called independent, but then at the same time not related to the government source, then it still would be better than using a government source, because they would of course be willing to show more of how much they're, how the government responded to these, petty protesters. So I went with, it's going to be an interesting, thing to see how it differs across both different sources. But I started with this one, because I thought, my chances of getting, something about decapitation or something about, like demobilization would actually be the harder case than how the government sources would say, oh, these protests have already demobilized because the government took care of it, if that makes any sense.
Because Katrin had to.
Yeah.
I really like the idea also getting like a bit more of the media into that, and as you said, maybe in another paper and not in that one. But one thing that came up when Christian just mentioned coding another newspaper that is maybe more leaning towards the government, maybe it would be interesting really going for one that's really leaning toward the government, and then you could also see whether, let's say, ratings and the rest are also followed by a government communication strategy. Because if you really think the channel is kind of, sending a strong signal, then my next question, of course, would be, but how do you send the signal? So what is the channel for sending the signals? It would be interesting to see whether you have the rates and then you have a really strong also communication of these effects in a very government-leaning newspaper, so to say.
Thank you. Yes.
So, Tijen, we tend to try to end with allowing the person who had the paper presented to kind of query the group, and then if we have an opportunity to kind of explore that here within the next minute or so, then we do so, or we could just like shoot you some comments offline. But anything that's kind of like lingering or remaining that you're just kind of like, you know, should I go this way or that way about?
Yeah, I mean, so okay, with the, you know, two different news sources, and then of course the more, you know, what Courtenay was saying about the, you know, the second, maybe the exogenous, you know, the government adjustment in response to dissident adjustment would be, you know, maybe the next bigger thing that I would do. And you know, maybe that would be a nice book project, right? And so I'm also, I'm wondering, you know, like what you think, if this is, you know, if I adjust, you know, the most important, you know, like doable things here, and then if this is something that you would see, you know, going in what kind of venues, you know, more sociology versus IR, you know, if you have any such, or comparative politics, if you have suggestions in that regard.
Open, folks. Erica.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you have, it kind of depends on which of our comments you take up and work through. I mean, if you added a transnational dimension to this, then I can imagine trying to hit kind of top tier IR journal. If you focus more on the sort of dissent and repression internal dynamic exclusively, I'd focus more on a comparative type journal, or kind of a subfield journal and conflict, so JCR or JPR or something like that.
No, I'm thinking that's actually a decent idea. I'm actually, you know, Zeynep, I forget the last name, but
Is it Zeynep Tüfekçi?
There's a social media and mobilization. I think Gezi Park is part of that.
That's her.
Yeah, yeah. I'm like the venues that she has tapped with regards to her work. I mean, that actually, like, those are decent locations. But I think also, like Erica's suggesting, you're signaling a great deal with the kind of like hook that you're going on. I think if you look at where the majority of the kind of like repression, dissent, repertoire stuff that came out, then that's, you know, JPR, JCR, CNPS, those types of journals. And I think depending upon how you're couching it or how you're going to land, I think that will be very useful. There's a strong kind of social movement element to it, which then suggests that maybe like mobilization might be a good venue.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're going to do that, then you definitely want to read and gather the kind of proper references and framings for the social movement crowd to kind of go there. But I think actually that's as good a spot to end. Eric and I are very glad that you all were able to come, and we'll endeavor to do our best to continue to move the format and keep it going. Everyone, thank you very much for showing up. Jin, thank you very much for your paper. I have some comments on the paper itself, which I'll send to you. I encourage everybody else to kind of do the same. If you're like me, you kind of take notes along the way, and then some aren't really smart enough to kind of make it into the public venue, but you have some other ones which are kind of nitpicky or useful, but you didn't have an opening to kind of provide those. And so I think that's very good. So
thank you so much. I really appreciate all of your comments. And if you could send me those in written form, that would be great. I tried to take notes, but sometimes it was getting, you know, like a little bit fast, so they may not make as much sense later on to me. So
that's why there's a recording. It's perfect.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, bye.